Welcome everybody. My name is Leslie Stevenson. I'm the publisher of Governance magazine, and welcome very much to this. Delighted to have so many of you on this webinar. So we all know that pace of change now is just ridiculous, and trying to keep directors' knowledge up to date is a real challenge for people, which is why we're having this webinar. We want this to be interactive, and so we would very much welcome you asking questions in the Q&A, ideally in the Q&A, because then that records it. You can ask throughout the beginning of this webinar, and then I'll curate the questions to the speakers when they've finished. A link to the recording is going to be sent to everybody afterwards, and we will also be sending you, in the spirit of keeping people's knowledge up to date, a new product that we're launching. Very proud to be working with Chris and Caridas, the team at Caridas, on, which is a governance roundup. So once a quarter, it just pulls out, highlights what's happened that quarter and what the implications are for boards. And we'll be sending you a free copy of the summer version of that after this webinar. So the format is going to be, Chris is going to give us a brief presentation, and then he's going to have a discussion with Loren and Claire, and during that discussion we'll be pulling in all of your questions and what have you. So to introduce our panelists, Chris Stamp is a governance professional, board reviewer and business advisor with a strong understanding of corporate governance in UK listed companies, which he's built up over 35 years. He founded Caridas in 2017 as an independent practice, providing corporate governance services to directors and company secretaries. He works with companies across a broad range of sectors, from FTSE 100 to small cap and AIM. He's a founder member of the Board Effectiveness Guild and a trainer on the Advanced Board Performance Review course run by the Chartered Governance Institute. Loren Wulfsohn is an international corporate governance advisor with over 2 decades of experience supporting boards, directors and executives across sectors and jurisdictions. She's held senior governance roles at Standard Bank Group and HSBC, and consulted in Australia and in the UK. She now leads Bridge Governance, a consultancy focusing on enhanced board decision-making through training, coaching and governance facilitation. And last but very much not least, Claire Davies is an independent governance consultant, a non-executive director and a solicitor stroke company secretary with 40 plus years of experience, principally in financial services. Claire previously held the role of Group Company Secretary at Legal & General, at Lloyds Banking Group and Barclays, and she's worked with clients including HSBC, RBS, Santander, Nationwide and M&G. Alongside her consultancy work, Claire is a non-executive director at Salix Finance Limited and is a tutor on the Financial Times Non-Executive Director Diploma. So that's introduced the panel. I'm going to pass over to you now, Chris, and I hope everyone enjoys the webinar.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and good afternoon, everybody. Just by way of introduction to the course, to this little presentation, I think it's just worth sort of me commenting on why are we discussing this subject. And I suppose for me, one of the areas that I get involved in with boards and company secretaries is board reviews. And I've always felt over the recent sort of years that the area that I feel is amongst the sort of least optimal of the discussions I have in those reviews is around directors' knowledge and how directors keep up to date. And so I thought it would be a really useful topic to discuss. And the next few slides that I'm going to present sort of really just introduce the subject, introduce some of the issues, and hopefully will be a springboard for comments from Claire and Loren and for questions from everyone on the webinar. But I think the sort of dissatisfaction perhaps that I feel does come from a sort of sense that there is a gulf emerging between the sort of skills and experience that you have around board tables and the sort of accelerating change and sort of changes to the risk profile that boards are experiencing. And I think there is some evidence for this. There was a very interesting article in the Financial Times a month or two ago, which really brought out a sense of frustration from executives and particularly CEOs who comment that they are not necessarily getting the sort of guidance and insight that they would expect from, particularly from non-executive directors given the challenges that they face in the sort of business world of today. And from a sort of board review perspective, I don't think my frustration or my sense of need for improvement is just me on my own. A recent report from Linstock, another board review firm, highlights that boards are identifying the need for increasing areas of specialism, increasing areas of knowledge around the board table. And this is becoming something that boards are identifying, particularly in the technology area. And perhaps if we can explore that a bit further in the next slide, there is an interesting survey undertaken by Hydrick and Struggles, which I've sort of pulled out a table from. And if you look at what they identify as the topics that boards most spend or are spending increasing amounts of time on, you go through that list and you see quite a few that I would regard as areas of sort of disruptive influence rather than just evolutionary influence. So we all know about AI and emerging technologies, and it is clear from those that the impact on businesses and organizations is far more than just a gradual change. This is really disruptive, and arguably you can look at a number of these risk categories and see that the impact is disruptive. It's changing the paradigm within which companies operate rather than just being a sort of gradual evolution of what they've always done. And I think that's important because it really challenges the traditional view of how boards work and how the sort of knowledge paradigm sort of works within the board. If we can look at the next slide, Leslie. If you think about boards traditionally, you have your executives, usually CFO and the CFO on a PLC board for sure, and you have a number of non-executives. And I think if I go back sort of 20, 30 years, there was a sense that your non-executives were there because of their knowledge, they were there because of their experience, and they kind of were expected to bring to bear all of that knowledge experience onto the board discussions. And there was a sense that they were sort of mentoring and providing answers to CEOs and executives because of their experience. And if you take the slide I've just shown and that sort of increasing sense of disruption and new areas of risk that really change the game compared to what may have been the case, 5, 10 years ago, it really then sort of brings into question, well, how relevant is past knowledge compared to the current situation we find today? And I think one of the issues that non-executives in particular have in this is partly their role. They are non-executives and they are expected to be non-executive, i.e. not involved in the day-to-day. But actually, a lot of these challenges require them to spend time and create opportunities to really get themselves up to speed. And I think that sort of is borne out by this sort of rather, if you like, traditional view of what the roles are within the boardroom. And perhaps there's a need to sort of change perceptions around that. But if you look at the kind of responses that I see companies and boards in particular making to this, the most common sort of solution that I think gets discussed, certainly if I look at the sort of board reviews that I've been involved in, is around the need to kind of create berths on the board for specialist subject area experts, particularly around technology and sometimes around ESG and sort of sustainability issues as well. But if you go to the next slide, you can see that this focusing of the issue around berths on the board does actually create a few problems for itself. The Linstock report from earlier this year actually looked at this particular question in quite a lot of detail. And I've put a couple of quotes in here, but essentially what it's saying is really the question is, should there be just specialists on the board, or actually should board directors really be generalists, bringing a broad broad range of experience to the board, and therefore is it really feasible to have people who are occupying the role of director who are only there because of a particular specialism? And I think this sort of dilemma gets heightened further when you think about the constraints on boards in terms of the number of factors that they're having to take account of when they make board appointments. This is not meant as a judgmental comment around diversity, but diversity considerations are expanding the pressures on boards to kind of be very careful about how they make new board appointments. I think there are sort of legal and governance constraints. Directors are legally responsible, not just for a particular area of business, but for the whole business. And so to bring someone onto the board who maybe understands a specialism very well, but not necessarily have a broader business knowledge can be in contrast to their responsibilities as a director under law. And I think as you get outside of particularly the largest companies and the largest boards, which tend to be in the sort of higher capitalized businesses, there does become a real issue with board size and cost, which makes the dilemma of recruiting specialists even more of a challenge. If you look at AIM listed companies, for example, they tend to have maybe 5 or 6 directors, 2 of whom are executives. And so having a specialist on that board becomes quite almost a luxury, actually, given the sort of precious nature of each individual position on that board. So births, in my view, this sort of specialism issue is a possible way of expanding board expertise and knowledge, but I don't necessarily think it's the solution or the entire solution. And so I think it's worth just thinking about what are the other opportunities to gain knowledge, and certainly looking at across the sort of boards which I think do this sort of thing very well. I think there are opportunities for directors to acquire knowledge sort of through external sources, but also I think it's about internal application and knowledge as well. Leslie, can we have the next slide, please? Picking up on the acquisition of knowledge, how are companies and how are boards doing this? Well, part of the response to this is around the use of time and making more use of time. And what I tend to see is boards, think using external speakers, obviously using possible advisors to bring in a sort of specialism either on a permanent basis or on a temporary basis just for a finite period of time, but also using opportunities to acquire knowledge outside of the board meetings themselves, the formal board meetings, through strategy sessions, away days, and even bringing the specialist external speakers into board meetings as a dedicated sort of learning opportunity. And on the internal side, I think one of the interesting areas where I think boards are understanding better, non-execs are understanding complex areas better, is when they start working with members of the management team, not necessarily the executive directors, but perhaps the specialists internally, to really learn how do you apply this sort of new disruptive knowledge into this company and industrial situation. And I've seen certainly in terms of technology, working groups being a very good way of dealing with issues like the application of AI or cyber and things like that. Again, picking up on the sort of time theme, we are seeing more sort of site visits, more meetings with key stakeholders, particularly that are engaged in the operational side of things, like customers and suppliers, and meetings again outside of the board where individual NEDs may just say, actually, can I spend time with the experts on this in my own time, as it were, outside of the sort of formalities of board discussion. All of these, I think, are good opportunities to gain knowledge, and I don't think there's necessarily a right answer to this, but I do think there is a need for boards to be more flexible in how they think about the need to gain knowledge, and imaginative in the use of the opportunities. Just picking up on a couple of final things before we finish. Who is responsible? I think probably traditionally directors have tended to arrange their own training. You see this particularly with audit chairs and directors who sort of bring a professional, their own professional background to a particular discussion. If they're members of an institute or used to attending sort of training sessions because of their background, then quite often they will carry on paying for their own updates and training. And I think the experience of companies really arranging and paying for directors' briefings outside of the board meetings themselves is still relatively unusual. But I think it is something that boards are going to need to think about more because of that need to sort of bring in the external perspective. And there is an important sort of facilitation role here for chairs and company secretaries to be proactive rather than reactive in this. And as I've highlighted on this slide, the company secretary in particular, I think, has a role in being proactive, and certainly the sort of UK Corporate Governance Code guidance makes that very clear, as you can see on the slide. Obviously, technology is never far away from the discussion, and I am not a technology expert by any means, but I do think it is important to reflect on whether technology is the solution. Where I stand on this, and I'm happy to be contradicted and disagreed with, is sort of yes and no. I think this is true of many things currently in terms of AI and so on. There are definitely ways in which technology can bring information to in a much more efficient way to directors and to everyone. In fact, obviously, online training provides useful ways of accessing information and indeed collaboration. But what worries me sometimes is where I sense that directors are almost seeing it as an opportunity to sort of outsource the use of judgment experience. And I don't think AI particularly is quite at that place yet, maybe in the future. And, you know, why are directors on the board? Well, they're there to really apply knowledge, not just to sort of understand it and apply it to the context of the board. And I think this is a key issue going forward, particularly with AI, that it isn't just about, you know, how can we use it, but how can we use it within context. So finally, just to sort of round this off, I thought I'd have a go at sort of looking to the future. I'm not a futurologist, and again, very happy to be contradicted on all of this. But what do I think the future of, do I think the future director will learn? Well, I think firstly, collaboratively, I think this sort of sense of directors sort of non-executive directors bringing that perceived wisdom into the boardroom will be challenged. And particularly if you look at, say, customers, for example, where the customers in the sort of Gen Z demographic are so different in their habits and in their sort of consumer choices to people like me who are baby boomers, that you will need to be working collaborative if you are to understand the context and what's happening in the market out there. As I've just mentioned, I think there is a need to optimize human intelligence with artificial intelligence, whatever that means going forward. And I think there is a need to be open around that. The point about time, I think, does mean that there will be a need to change the perception of non-executives and encourage much more immersion in the day-to-day business and the challenges that brings for non-execs, so that, to go back to the quote at the beginning, CEOs and executives are feeling that they are getting more support in a much more meaningful way. And I think the challenge for non-executives through this is that the currency of when they were executives is not necessarily the currency of the future non-exec. And so what this is all about is actually ensuring that every member of the board retains currency in their knowledge and their ability to apply it. So those are my comments to introduce it. I hope that this has provided everyone with some food for thought, and I hope that the rest of the webinar will be taking up some really good discussion points. There's a few on the slide here we'll use as a basis for discussion, but I'll hand back to Leslie so that we can open the discussion out.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thank you for really interesting way to highlight the discussions. So, as I say, please do put any questions in the Q&A as we're going through, but we're now going to have a sort of a discussion amongst Chris, Claire and Loren on these issues. And Claire, I'm going to start with you. So this whole idea of specialists and generalists on a board, which I think is really interesting, you know, sort of if you've got someone who knows a lot about technology, do they know a lot about the rest of the business? So what's been your experience with the boards you've been working on? Have you noticed any trends or commonalities at all?
Well, I think, Leslie, it's very mixed, really, because I think it depends on where companies are in their cycle and what the rationale is really for looking for all that expertise. So I'd say it's very much horses for courses. As Chris has said, there's certainly growing demand for specialists in areas like cyber, ESG, digital sustainability, those things that wouldn't have been a common area of focus for the board or the executive in the days when perhaps some of the current NEDs were, executives in their own rights. So the skills that they bring, whilst there are still some very core competencies, need to be updated to reflect what's going on in the current world. So I've seen both happen, really. I think if you take cyber as an example, I would say probably maybe 7, 8 years ago, there was a tendency for everybody to want to rush out and find a cyber, or perhaps more correctly, digital expert, because everybody, felt that their board needed that as an area of expertise. But I think now that's becoming more of an inherent sort of central risk for firms, and a lot of them are actually saying, well, all the board need that. We can't rely just on a specialist. So I think you'll see a mix of approaches across different companies. I think it probably is more common for a board to look for a specialist if there's an urgent need. So there's some immediate threat or some recurring threat in relation to cyber, let's say, where they need somebody who really can help direct the board. Or perhaps, as is often the way in financial services, there's a regulatory expectation that you'll have somebody with that expertise, or indeed your stakeholders, shareholders, are looking for you to enhance your board. And sometimes I think it's the board itself that says, they don't really feel they have a sufficient voice to challenge the executive, that really they're having to go along with what they're told because they don't have the necessary expertise. But then I think, on the other hand, what you regularly see is boards questioning whether they want to take up one of the spaces on the board, as Chris talks about, the berths on the board, with a specialist when there's so many other areas that need to be covered. So I think a lot of it will depend on the sector and, how important it is, how central it is. So tech companies, probably financial services, and increasingly retail, may feel they need that expertise on the board. Others may feel that it's something that they can buy in professional advice. One thing I have seen is the rise of board observers who are experts, who, particularly where there's a committee rather than the board looking at IT or cyber risks, it's quite common to see a board observer who has those expertise, who will sit alongside the board but isn't a director themselves. And basically, I think as businesses begin to realise that, tech is obviously often the main way of doing business these days, they'll decide that it's something that directors should have collective knowledge of it. and also, you know, you have to bear in mind that some individuals don't necessarily want to take on the role as the specialist on the board, because there are additional responsibilities. You know, there's liability for the whole board. But if you're a director with specialist knowledge, the Section 174 Companies Act does say that you are expected to exercise that knowledge in a way that's higher than is expected of other directors. And sometimes, you know, boards just don't want a single voice representing them. There can be a tendency sometimes for the expert to become a bit dominant and a bit cozy with the executive. And so sometimes the board say, no, we want a broader view of this particular area. So I think, you know, there's no one size fits all. I think companies will all need to look at what's right for them at that given time. I do wonder if it is potentially just a temporary thing, because obviously the demographic of NEDs at the moment probably is still towards, you know, the upper end of the age group. And so people who haven't actually lived and worked through the cyber era. But actually executives who are now working in those roles, who are looking for future NED roles, are perhaps more familiar with those sorts of issues. They're living and breathing them. ESG, sustainability, no doubt other new things will jump in the way over time. But in terms of some of the current gaps, I suspect they'll be filled as the new, you know, cohorts of executives take on non-executive roles.
Thank you, Claire. And Loren, with because both of you have worked extensively with lots and lots of boards, does that reflect your what you're noticing?
100%. I mean, I completely support what Claire said. I think that from a specialist or having a generalist kind of perspective, it definitely depends on the company, depends on the industry, and it also depends on some of those what were specialist skills are now fairly commoditized, and there's an expectation that all directors will have them. A sort of technologies is one of those where there's an expectation now that people are a little bit more understanding around technology issues, sustainability, etc., where you want the board in general to be advised, and that there isn't one particular voice. You do run the risk where you do have that specialist on besides the duties, where everybody then defers to that individual, and you end up with authority bias in your boardroom, where you're looking to the hippo, the highest paid opinion and the highest paid person's opinion. The same thing happens with the board where you get a specialist on, is that the rest of the board almost seem to become demotivated to participate or to increase their knowledge in that particular area. So I think getting a specialist on, there's got to be for me a sort of particular driving need, as Claire alluded to want that particular spot to be taken up by specialist skills, rather than having somebody who can add greater and more extensive and broad value to the board.
Brilliant, thank you. And Chris, have you got any final comments you want to add to that?
Not really. I mentioned my views, I guess, in the presentation. I think it is an evolving sort of understanding, I would say, and as already been said, there's no sort of right or wrong answer to this. I do think it's about boards being aware of the dangers of just sort of having a specialist and assuming that's the answer to the problem. But you know, it will be more appropriate in some companies than others, I'm sure. So I think it's a matter of being wise in your judgment around it, really.
Yeah, as Claire says, horses for courses, I think. So, Loren, what do you think the role of the company secretary is in helping the board keep up to date?
I think the company secretary has a crucial or critical role in this particular area of board practice. I think that part of the governance professional role that the company secretary fulfills is to ensure that you've got a board that can be seen as a strategic asset that is best positioned to enable it to make good decisions and to operate effectively. And that's a key role of the company secretary. So I do think right from whether it be, I think we've got to go back to induction, which is also a form of initial learning, through to ongoing education. I think the company secretary plays a vital role in that process and in establishing a framework for that learning. Also, the company secretary is really well placed to ensure that you are that there's time. I mean, I think one of the critical things that flows through all of this is time, and where do you find more time? Where do you find more time with non-executive directors when you've already got bulging agendas and all sorts of demands on increased time? How do you create this time within your board and committee agendas during the year? You've got to plan ahead as one basic thing, just to ensure that you create that time. And obviously you need to be able to create a plan that is agile and that will enable the sort of intervening requirement for education that will happen as you go through your year. But I think the company secretary is well positioned to help set the agenda around training. And also because of the role that they play in relation to the board, being in the boardroom, they're also really well positioned to establish what the board's ongoing educational needs are. They have first sight, they sit around the table. Part of that emotional intelligence about sitting around the board table as a company secretary is understanding and picking up when there are gaps in knowledge that are apparent through discussion, not necessarily through any other knowledge source that you have. So I think the ability to pick up on that and to help structure and define what that training looks like, obviously not always a subject matter expert, but helping those who are to deliver a training that is fit for purpose in order to meet any educational needs the board might have, is a crucial role of the company secretary. And I think that the other thing as well is that they form a bridge, not just one way, but the other way, and also helping management to understand what the board's needs are is also a critical role of the company secretary, again, to make sure that what's being delivered is fit for purpose. And I think maybe just a final point on sort of what I think the company secretary role is. I think there's also, they can facilitate and help the chair to create a culture around ongoing learning. This isn't we talk about the kinds of directors we need, and in the environment we're living in, and Chris did a good job of introducing that and around sort of the topics that we're looking at, and we're living in the state of constant volatility. So you need to have board directors who are willing to commit to that ongoing and continual learning. And the company secretary can help in that process, and perhaps things like, for instance, adding an expectation and letters of appointment around these are your expected board days and your commitment around board days. But actually, there's also, we expect this from you on an ongoing, in order to keep your skills up to date and to ensure ongoing learning and education. So I think there are many facets, but I do think it's an absolutely critical role that the company secretary has to play.
Thank you. And Claire, do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously the company secretary has a really pivotal role, and they'll know the inside of the organisation, but also be supporting the NEDs. I think one of the things I would say is it's very important that you kind of distinguish between training and knowledge, because for me, there's the training which is perhaps more formal, and knowledge which the company necessarily needs to impart to the directors to help them make the decision. And I think for the company secretary, perhaps being clear to non-exec directors in particular what the company is going to provide by way of briefings, etc., versus what formal training they'll provide. Because you kind of feel, well, directors are appointed for their skills and experience, and so they need to bring a baseline with them. They'll come with certain knowledge and experience which will benefit the company. And notwithstanding that we're also looking at lots of new areas, the basic role that the NEDs provide of experience and challenge is still very valuable to companies. They're looking at big picture. They don't need to be into the detailed operational technical side. They still apply that big picture strategic view. So I think that's still valid. But I think it is helpful for directors to understand what the company is going to provide and what directors are kind of expected to bring for themselves and to keep up to date. So I think the idea of the forward plan, looking at what's going to come through the board through the year, and you may not be able to agree the full year's training or briefings at the start of the year, but certainly you would expect to know when it's going to happen, and then some of the issues might emerge, as the year goes on. But certainly the COSEC should be working with NEDs, making clear what the company is going to provide, and then it's kind of left to NEDs to decide what they may need to go to get privately.
So that brings us back to the point, one of the points that Chris was making, is who ultimately ought to be responsible for this? Is it sort of from what you're saying, it sounds like you think it's a sort of combination of both the company and the individual non-exec?
I think it is a combination, but I mean, in principle, if you ultimately had to say who is responsible, I would say it's the non-executive, the director, because the director is appointed for their skills and experience. And so they need to make sure that those remain relevant to the company. And very often directors will have a portfolio. So, you know, they're not just looking to one company to be trained in how they do things. So I've seen it sort of compared to an airline pilot. The airline pilot knows how to fly, but when they go to a particular company, they need to understand what the requirements are for that company. And if directors have a portfolio, they need to make sure that they're keeping their core competencies and knowledge up to date. But in practice, and I guess this is where we start straying from training to knowledge, because in practice, it's the responsibility of the chair, with the support of the company secretary, to make sure that directors have the information they need to take decisions. And so it is up to the company to make sure that directors are getting the company specific, market specific, you know, and sector specific information. And if directors aren't getting that, and very often that will come through the board effectiveness review, they should be highlighting that. But if directors genuinely feel that they're not getting good enough information, sometimes they'll just reflect it on the basis that they think board papers aren't good enough, but it goes well beyond board papers. You know, they should seriously be considering whether they can fulfill their role of director at its extreme. So ultimately, I would say it is down to the individual directors to ensure that they have the initial knowledge to take up the role, the knowledge and experience to take up the role of a director, and the ongoing knowledge to ensure that they can take effective decisions.
Thank you. And actually, Tanya's just asked a question, which I'll address to you, Chris, in the first instance. She says, isn't the chair ultimately responsible for ensuring that the board has the right knowledge and skills?
I think the chair has a role in facilitating a discussion around knowledge and skills, and if there are gaps emerging, perhaps picking up on the discussion about the role of the company secretary, then ensuring that the discussion, the issues are facilitated, discussed, and an appropriate response is made. I think, as Claire said, there's issues around knowledge, there's issues around training, and sort of it kind of depends a little bit about, well, what are we talking about? As Claire was talking, and I certainly didn't disagree with anything she was saying, I was reflecting that one of the areas where the sort of need for greater knowledge comes maybe in a sort of strategy discussion that really looks along at long-term trends, and the people who are most likely to be aware of those sorts of needs in terms of knowledge will be the executives who are actually closer to the coalface in terms of what the business does, closer to seeing the horizons. And so I think there is an element of executives needing to inform the sort of discussion about, well, what requirements are there. One of the things I talked about was that sort of use of experts, and quite often I've seen boards bringing people who can talk about the market, people who can talk about technology into strategy kind of sessions to enable the board, and particularly the non-execs, to really get up to speed on where things are. So within that particular conversation, I would say there is a responsibility among the execs, and arguably the co-sec on a day-to-day basis is going to be closer to that conversation than possibly the chair. It really depends. So I think to answer the question, I think the chair has to ensure that there is a proper discussion about what what knowledge, what training, what understanding does the board need, and ensure that where there are gaps, that is being addressed by whoever is the right person to address it. But obviously the chair is not going to be the one who does all the work around this. It's a sort of collaborative effort.
Thank you, Lauren. Have you got anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I think it is. I think Chris has covered it quite extensively. I think the chair is obviously he's the captain on the ship, and it's his role to ensure that he has the right skills around the table, and it's also his role to ensure that they're getting the right information. But at the end of the day, as an individual director, you've also got to make sure that you are in possession of what you need in order to make the right decisions, which is really, it's actually a difficult place to be, because as we know, being a director is not an easy job. Being a NED, you're not involved in the day-to-day, and you're reliant on what management is giving you. So you don't always know the right questions to ask. But I think that as a director, you've got to be critically observing what's going on in the boardroom and making sure that you're asking the questions to ensure that you feel there's a level of assurance that you have got the right information to ask the decision. So I guess a bit of fence sitting, but everybody's got an amount of responsibility. But absolutely, at the end of the day, the chair is the captain of the ship, but there's also individual director liability and responsibility for making sure that they can make the right decisions.
And actually, Susanna's just adding in another person. She's saying, what about the role of the chief people officer, where that exists at a senior level? Are they not also key in terms of understanding skill gaps and design and the purchase of training when needed? Isn't that another area where the company secretary chair should work closely with the chief people officer? Would you agree?
In my experience, I would say no, not really. I mean, the chief people officer typically is, I know there are some different models in certain companies, but typically the chief people officer looks after the employees of the organization and wouldn't typically set the training for board. The board is obviously have very different needs. Sometimes there can be mandatory training that all the organisation, including the NEDs, go through. That might well be something that the chief people officer is involved in. But in my experience, it's the chief people officer would probably not, with a few notable exceptions, have a good understanding of what the board's need is, because they would be more executive facing than non-executive.
I agree with. Sorry,
no, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to support Claire's view. I think that there are different models in different organizations where you see chief people officers perhaps sitting around the boardroom table more, but I do think the role is quite different and distinct in relation to executives versus the board and the board skill set.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, and it goes to your point earlier, Claire, I think, about non-execs still are bringing the benefit of their knowledge, of their awareness across a sort of wider horizon, and particularly if they're involved in other companies. And so I think unless you've got a sort of chief people officer who's really tuned into what the directors might need, I think that's more likely to be the exception rather than the rule. And I think perhaps if I can, Leslie, pick up on the first question about the balance of Ned's involvement, which I think is a very good question, because there are, I think we've all been aware of non-execs who kind of see themselves in a very executive light and get too involved with companies, too involved in the day-to-day, and sort of almost to the point of annoying everyone because of that. I think what I have in mind around that extension of sort of time and involvement is a move away from just seeing the role of the non-exec as to turn up to board meetings and perhaps a board dinner or a sort of bit of committee work beforehand, to actually build that sort of time into their commitment to the company that allows for either the training and or the knowledge acquisition, whether that's through through ensuring that they do spend time in the business through site visits, or spend time in sort of meetings with executives around particular topics, whatever it is. And this is again where the chair and the co-sec and others may need to define what that actually looks like within the context of that company. But the danger is definitely there that if you kind of open it out too much, some directors will just go and become executive when they should be non-exec, and you don't want that. But I think it is about designing the acquisition of knowledge and training that is appropriate to someone who has got that experience as a non-exec, and helping them to be able to apply their experience better within a sort of changing world and a changing context.
Any extra comments from Claire or Loren?
I mean, I think that getting NEDs involved in the business needs to be quite carefully managed, because otherwise there can be a tendency for them, very often they're information hungry, they're very curious by their nature, and they want to know probably a lot more than they need to know. So careful management, I would say, so that they aren't given the opportunity to dive too much into the detail. But it is a good question, and in practice can be quite difficult to manage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So Colin has asked, by way of board composition, is there a need to rethink our definition of diversity away from traditional age, race, religion, etc., to a wider definition encompassing bigger societal, economic and environmental considerations, and alongside a greater emphasis on soft skills like curiosity, critical thinking, courage, compassion, and an ability to engage with people from all walks of life, thus enriching the quality of discussion and decision making? Well, there's a question, Loren.
I mean, it's great. I did read the question. I thought it was a great question, and I love the extent and the depth in the query. I definitely think that I think we are in a position where, although we might have diversity targets, which might be based on traditional requirements, which I think aim to ensure that our boards reflect society to some extent. I think that we definitely in a world where diversity goes way beyond that, and cognitive diversity is probably one of the key things that you're looking for on a board, that you want people to bring different perspectives, different views. You don't want groupthink within a boardroom. That's not effective, and you're not necessarily going to get the best outcomes. So I don't know that I would like to personally define what that diversity looks like, but I do think there are elements of qualitative and quantitative in what a person brings to a board. A board is an interesting ecosystem, and it relies both on people who show all of those characteristics, the empathy, the sympathy. You need people who care about employees, and you hope that's more than just one person who comes with the empathy diversity tag. So I do think that agreed that I think that diversity isn't simple, but I do think we are at a stage where generally boards are looking for more than just ticking requirements from a regulatory perspective, and you are looking for people who can bring curiosity, who can bring critical thinking, but at the same time work effectively within a board. You still want a board that works effectively together. So there's a behavioral and cultural element to it too. But yes, absolutely, we need to think more broadly around the people we have around, and the skills and the characteristics that we want around the table.
Thank you. Have you got Claire or Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
I would agree with Loren. I think in theory that is what diversity was originally about. I think originally it was talked about, diversity of background, thought and judgment, and it was supposed to encompass a whole range of things. But in practice, because disclosures have tended to be around gender and ethnicity, I think, it's the usual thing that what gets monitored is, tends to be what happens in practice. So, but absolutely agree, boards would benefit from that wider perspective. I think what I would say to that is part of the difficulty, boards are obviously usually a small collection of people, so you haven't got hundreds of them to give places to. And very often when somebody is truly diverse or different from the, in terms of approach to the way people sit around the board table, you can see that they're just never going to get that space on the board, because people do tend to, still point in their own image or, people that they get along with. And it's quite rare for boards to appoint somebody who is truly maverick or different from them, but that probably is where the value would sit. So I agree, that is what we should be striving for. But human beings tend not to want to appoint somebody who's really going to irritate them.
Absolutely. And sticking with the sort of diversity theme for the moment, Hannah's asked, how do you see the role of next gen or shadow boards or cross-generational board education collaboration? The first time we have 5 generations working together, there's a very good book out about that by Patrick Dunn and Rebecca Robbins. It seems like shadow next gen boards are becoming more popular. Do you think this trend will continue? Which kinds of companies and which kinds of NEDs will most benefit from this? So, Chris, do you want to go on that one to start with?
I'd love to. Yes, I think it's a great idea. It is something that I'm beginning to see applied. I think it is. I think it is actually strategically critical for some businesses because the way that the sort of Gen Z, Gen X, the way different demographics think is really impacting on consumer choices, how they work, look at attitudes to sort of home working, stuff like that. And I think it is important that if you've got a board that is baby boomers, that they understand that now. And if you've got a forum by which these sort of demographic sort of different attitudes across the demographics can be articulated and then discussed with boards, it has to be a good thing. And I think that companies, some companies are recognizing that, and it's quite a good way. It's a little bit like, I guess, employee councils and so on. It's a good way of gathering a sense of what particular stakeholder group might be thinking, but it gets you away from that sort of need to have someone in every board meeting all of the time, which obviously is part of the issue with boards. So I think we probably don't see a lot of it right now, but I do think we see more of it than we did, and I suspect it probably will be an expanding or an increasing trend over the coming years.
Claire, got anything to add?
I've worked with a couple of organisations that have a youth board. I think you had to be under 30 to be on it, and I was always blown away by what they came up with, because it was a very different way of thinking. So I think it really is important to understand particularly, as you say, the cross-generational views and what's important. As you said at the beginning, Leslie, I'm a NED on Salix Finance, and they have a number of graduate trainees, and at the last board, the graduate trainees came to sit with our, to observe our board and to contribute on various things. And again, absolutely amazing insights and just a very, very different way of looking at things. So I think it definitely is very valuable. Doesn't necessarily have to be a board, but I think having that opportunity to engage very closely with different groups within the organisation is really important.
Have you got any experience with that, Loren?
Yes, I have, and I think that it works. It works really well. I think it's one of those internal, external voices that directors need to hear, that they don't automatically get. But I think it's also a critical part of, you think about ongoing training as a session where you get somebody in and you present to the board, and I actually think doing things like that is also a critical upskilling for the directors, and having that internal perspective, that brings them an idea of what the next generation's thinking, what the consumers might be thinking, and just changes perspectives and provides them with a broader view is incredibly valuable.
Thank you. And Catherine's asked about the book. So let me just hold this up. This is the book. We will put a link when we send you the email. We'll put a link into it. It's called 5 Generations at Work: How We Win Together for Good, published by Wiley, by Rebecca Robbins and Patrick Dunn. So we'll keep a link on that. We'll send you a link on that. Someone, an anonymous attendee, has asked, when appointing advisors, so you're going back to the sort of specialist idea, whether to a committee or to the board, would you recommend that this follows the same onboarding as a trustee or a director? So our advisors are appointed but don't follow the same level of due diligence. And she wonders if if that's best practice. This is obviously coming from a charity, actually, that's why it's trustees, and what other charities do. Who's got any comments on that? How would you onboard an advisor?
I'm happy to kick off on this. I think there's a degree to which anyone who is a frequent sort of visitor to the boardroom needs to understand the way in which boards work and sort of the responsibilities that they're under, and whether it's advisors. I mean, I go back to many years to being sort of involved in pension trustees when we had member nominated trustees that were sort of brought in from the workforce, and you know the just explaining how a sort of trustee meeting or a board meeting works, what are the sort of issues around, you know, confidentiality, market sensitivity if you're a PLC and so on, is quite key. So I think there is a need to have a degree of training and sort of scene setting for anyone who's going to have be a regular part of a board dialogue. Obviously, you know, they're not necessarily a trustee, or they're not necessarily a sort of statutory director. So that sense of really kind of indoctrinating them about their sort of legal responsibilities may not work to the same level. But I think it is good to convey a sense to anyone like that this is what the board is actually all about. This is what the board is there to do, and therefore, you know, understand your role within that context. So some sort of training, I think, is important, but may not be quite the same as you'd give as a sort of NED induction program. But I'm be interested to see what Claire or Loren think on that.
Loren, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, and it all depends. I hate to say it depends, but it is quite contextual. It depends on what the role is, what the advisor's coming in to do. As Chris said, as you know, I think any training you can give the person on the way in so that they understand the culture, they understand the company, they understand the context of in which they're going to be operating, and providing that advice is obviously invaluable. But I wouldn't say to the extent knowing what a new board director or new trustee has to go through from an induction perspective on a general basis around the entity. I wouldn't think it would be as extensive, and I don't think that's necessary, but certainly any assistance you can provide on the way in order to make them operate more effectively, even as an advisor, is obviously invaluable.
Well, I just wonder what is meant by due diligence there, whether you meant whether the person asking the question meant more about the level of checks that you make versus the onboarding. But so totally agree with what Chris and Loren have said about the onboarding. In terms of due diligence, usually they'll have come through a procurement process, and as a consultant, I generally find the procurement process is far more intensive than any checks that are done on directors. So, you know, by the time you've completed your 50th page of all the, you know, information. So if it's that sort of due diligence, I think usually, provided your procurement process is thorough enough, you probably have covered off all the suitability checks.
Brilliant, thank you. And Jeremy's asked, how does the panel view the ability to provide berths for new directors and for those being experienced generalists? He says, is there room for an inexperienced specialist to gain generalist experience on their initial director appointment? Who would like to comment on that?
I mean, I'm happy to give it a go. I think that it depends on the company. You know, you're not going to get appointed to a very technical entity, a very complex regulated entity, if necessarily just for a specialist skill, unless as we said earlier, there's a special need and requirement for it. They are going to be looking for somebody who can add more general value. But obviously, it's not to say that there isn't the opportunity for specialists to gain that. But I think it would have to depend on the individual and their ability to upskill. As Claire said earlier, you know, it's a responsibility of the individual director to come with those skills. So you can't expect the company that you're going to be on the board to be paying all of your school fees. You are going to have to come with some basic knowledge beyond your specialist skills. in order to add value. So I don't think it's possible, but I suspect quite difficult in a more regulated environment.
Brilliant, thank you. So now I'd also like to ask all three of you whether or not, in your experience, have you seen any particularly interesting examples of innovative ways in which boards are keeping their knowledge up to date? Chris, do you want to go first?
Nothing's sort of specific, I guess. There's a slightly broader answer to the question, which is really thinking around the time that boards spend together. And I am impressed by companies that or boards that take the view, look, we're together for 2 or 3 days for a board meeting. Why don't we use that time to leverage board knowledge and board dialogue outside the sort of governance formalities of a 2 or 3 hour board meeting? And I put some of those in the presentation, but you know, I think getting people in to sort of demonstrate things, people in to talk about from their specialism over a dinner. You know, board dinners are not particularly new, but actually using them as an educational opportunity rather than just a social opportunity, I think is something I think works really well, because I think board, you know, people can explore ideas, go where you might not want to go when you've got someone taking minutes and so on, and just really challenge and talk as sort of equals rather than Neds and execs and so on. So I think it's about being creative in the use of time within the context of how your board actually works. It's probably not a very specific example, but I do think it's an important thing to think about.
Claire.
I think it has to be a combination of things. I don't think there's just one thing that works. I mean, generally, I think you build your knowledge through, you know, a bit of reading, a bit of practical application. Sometimes it's trial and error, you know, sort of learning what works and doesn't. Obviously, digital developments have really helped here, because I have found over the years that directors, whilst they ask for additional training or briefings, actually really don't like tacking on the extra time, as Chris says, to a board meeting. The other thing I have felt, particularly with perhaps older Neds, is they're not very good at paying attention during a more classroom style session. So I think digital training where they can go away, do it in their own time is useful. And I think there's lots of external packages that do this. A lot of organizations, particularly bigger organizations, develop their own. I haven't seen them particularly well tailored towards Neds. As we said earlier, they typically are done for the whole organization, and then Neds are asked to go through them. But I think there's definitely scope for doing more for Neds. I think obviously getting them involved in a lot of external groups. So, you know, for audit chairs, the Big Four all seem to do audit clubs or whatever. So there's additional training. One of the things I've seen work quite well in financial services, and definitely something that the regulators really like, is case studies and scenario planning, rather than just typical classroom, but taking an example and directors working through together. And I do tend to see directors slightly better behaved in those styles of sessions, because they're involved, they're engaged, and they can all, it feels real, as opposed to just sitting listening in a classroom. So I would say the scenario planning is something that I'm seeing a lot more of in case studies, and they seem to be working effectively.
Thank you. And just before I come to you, Loren, so Catherine's just raised something as well. And she says, I wonder if there are some real basics that can be missed, for example, making the most of news, media and channels that offer insight as part of day-to-day for culture, geopolitical, cyber attacks and what have you. I think that's a fair comment.
I do think so. I mean, I think that I was reading something recently which said directors want less presentation, more discussion, because time is of the essence. And I think your ability, so I agree with what a lot of Chris said, and Claire as well, as to how you deliver that training is so very critical. And I think in a modern age where there's so much happening, there's so many information sources, it's how you can best channel that and use the director's time to make sure that whatever you're presenting or giving to them by way of ongoing education is pertinent to the company, it's relevant, and it's timely. You know, somebody said earlier that there'll be portfolio directors, they'll sit on various boards and they'll be getting a lot of information around similar types of developments from multiple companies. The key trick, I think, is how you take that information and make it relevant to your company and to the issues your directors are needing to discuss. So I think that for me, where I'm seeing good developments in ongoing board education is around how do you use the time that you've got with the directors in the most efficient way, and how do you make sure that whatever you're giving them is very much focused towards how they like to learn. Agreed with Claire, nobody wants to sit in a classroom and be lectured at and spoken to and have a presentation. It's how you can give them information in a way that's easily digestible for them, whether it be in takeaway, whether you establish a resource center, that you find a way of curating relevant news articles. And you should absolutely be using AI for this. You know, AI is it's all sort of guardrails, etc. required, but you can take 5 articles on the same topic and synthesize them into something that makes it relevant for your board, with very little effort. Obviously, you need to review it and you need to make sure, etc., etc. But I think the use of AI in order to provide education in a digestible format for your non-executives is absolutely key to the future of how you might want to develop an ongoing board training program. Another thing that's really useful, and it's although it sounds, and I forget what one of my fellow panelists mentioned it earlier, is actually referring your directors to relevant external courses. So creating a list that you curate on an ongoing basis, which might have relevant external courses relevant to your directors in their various stages of development, relevant to the context of your company, what you'd want to do from a strategic perspective that might help supplement their knowledge. And it also gives that external view, gives them the ability to network. It gives them the ability to meet, you know, as Claire said, you put them in touch as well with the sort of large accounting firms, etc. have these clubs where are relevant. Those are fantastic because, you know, then your directors are also getting other perspectives and come back with those perspectives into your company, just enriching their contribution. Just some thoughts.
Brilliant, thank you. Actually, that's because obviously I'm also involved in the Financial Times training program, and we find that quite often it's mixing with the other people around the table as well as what the people are teaching you from the front, and we try and make a lot of having interactive conversations. Having that definitely resonates. So I think we've got to come to the end now, I'm afraid, but thank you to the panelists, to Chris, to Claire and to Loren for a fascinating discussion. Really, really useful. And thank you to all of you for your questions and your thoughtful comments. We will be sending, as I said, the link to the recording and your free copy of the summer Ceridas governance roundup. Please do, if you've got any suggestions for other webinars, we do love running these and we want to make sure that people enjoy them. And that's it. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.